Hello, Jesse. Hello, Morgan. How are you? Hello, Vidhi. All right, let's get started then. Welcome to the meeting. This week we have no DevaWare meeting. We're getting ready for Embodied Intelligence Workshop and some other things as well. I'm kind of working on those slowly. So that's good. A lot of things to talk about today. The first is following up from last week. We mentioned this chatbot UI here. This is NeuroPilot. This is something I think that Morgan mentioned when we were talking about post-training large language models. So what this is a type of large language model that allows you to describe your experiment and let NeuroPilot simulate it. So I'm going to try something here. Rad in virtual reality. And it's going to process my request. It's going to select my models. It's going to run the model. And then it's going to analyze the results and generate the report. So I don't know how long this will take. We'll have to see. But let me go back to some screenshots of some things I already picked up here. So I asked a question, what happens in the brain when a person interacts in virtual reality? And it gives me a bunch of models that I could use to look at different aspects of this problem. So this is obviously a German group that's doing this because things are kind of mixed in German and in English here. But basically, it gives me the Hodgkin-Huxley model, the adaptive exponential integrate and fire neuronal model, A.G.E 2003, which is, of course, the book on computational neuroscience, spike timing dependent plasticity, and then a current-based network. So it gives me a number of different models to work with, and I can open those up, and when this thing gets done running, we'll open it up and see what they give you. And then there's some other related questions. What happens in the brain during a psychedelic trip? And can a neural network sustain activity without input? So that's just kind of a quick demo of the interface. And then going into one of these topics, so spike timing dependent plasticity, they give you a scenario. Neurons in the motor cortex receive feedback from VR interactions, engaging in timing-based synaptic modifications. And then these are some sample graphs of an analysis here from a simulation that they're doing. And that's for that specific model. And then this is the A.G.E 2003 example. So this is where neurons create a spatial map of a virtual environment through complex firing patterns, enabling navigation and orientation. And again, this is a simulation that was run based on the models presented in this book, and it gives you that example there. All right, so it's still processing, it's analyzing the results. It's going to take a while to do this. We can come back to it if you have any questions. So while we wait for this, I'll go on to this paper from the Transmitter, this article from the Transmitter. This is by Ava Dyer and Blake Richards. And they're going to talk about accepting the bitter lesson and embracing the brain's complexity. So this is a neuro AI perspective. So I think the better lesson here is that sort of reductionist experiments aren't going to get us to the point where we can understand the brain enough to interface with it or simulate it in any meaningful way. So, we need things like multimodal models, brain-wide models and to mix those with very specific models of different brain regions and different functions. So they have this illustration, which I think is just kind of like a piece of art. But basically, they talk about multimodal models. Successful efforts must make sense of data sets that mix electrophysiology, imaging, and behavior results. So you need to have a lot of different things that you're measuring simultaneously across the brain. So to gain insight into complex neural data, we must move towards a data-driven regime, training large models on vast amounts of information. We asked 9 experts on computational neuroscience and neural data analysis to weigh in. So this is where they kind of get you got to have a position, and then they kind of explore that position a little bit. So we start with, it is often said that the brain is the most complex object in the universe. Whether this cliche is actually true or not, it points to an undeniable reality. That is, neural data is incredibly complex and difficult to analyze. Neural activity is context-dependent and dynamic, the result of a lifetime of multisensory interactions and learning. It is nonlinear and stochastic as well, thanks to the nature of synaptic transmission and dendritic processing. It is high-dimensional, emerging from many neurons spanning different brain regions, and it is diverse, being recorded from many different species, circuits, and experimental tasks. And so what that means is that we have these kind of, we usually think of studying the brain as using specific, highly controlled experimental settings where we record data and we can say something about a specific function in the brain, but the problem is those are unlikely to generalize both across brain regions and across subjects. So if you're trying to build, say, a neural interface for someone, there's been this persistent problem in brain-computer interfaces where only a subset of the subjects who are tested they actually match the expectation for neural activity. So if you develop an algorithm for decoding neural activity, it maybe works on about 70, maybe 60 to 70% of your subjects, and the rest of them, it works in a different way. So this is a problem, of course, where we need to embrace the complexity instead of getting rid of the complexity. But that also requires us to take different methods and interpret our findings a little bit differently. So when training on data from a dynamic, nonlinear, stochastic, high-dimensional system, such as the brain, the chances for a failure in generalization multiply, because it is actually impossible to control all the potentially relevant variables in the context of controlled experimental settings. Moreover, as the field moves towards more naturalistic behaviors and stimuli, we effectively increase the dimensionality of the system we are analyzing. So how can we make progress? How do we kind of, we obviously, it's going to be a problem to do these sort of reductionist, localized experiments in the brain and then bring them together into a unified model for the brain. So we have this series of disjointed models tied to specific experimental circumstances, and we're asking those studies to sort of generalize magically across the brain the described systems. So it's kind of hard to do. And this is sort of, they're putting their marker down for the dynamical view of cognition or the dynamical view of neuroscience and saying that this is basically what we need for neural AI. So as the field moves towards more naturalistic behaviors and stimuli, we effectively increase the dimensionality of the system we are analyzing. So this notion of system dimensionality is important as well, that, we talk about dimensionality reduction, but one of the things in that, in doing so, is that we have a method that successfully removes like everything that's sort of redundant and gives us a signal that, captures the information from those higher dimensions. So, there's no evidence that in doing a lot of these, uh, tightly controlled but disjointed experiments that we're actually doing it. So, okay, so then their position here is, how can we make progress then in developing a general model of neural computation rather than a series of disjointed models? We believe that the key is to embrace the complexity of neural data rather than attempting to sidestep it. To do this, neural data needs to be analyzed by artificial intelligence. Well, that's great. So that's our sort of insight here. AI has already demonstrated its immense utility in analyzing and modeling complex nonlinear data. So they talk about the 2024 Nobel Prize in Chemistry that went to the team that basically developed AlphaFold, and they were able to solve the problem of predicting protein folding, which is a complex task upon which traditional modeling techniques had failed to make significant headway. I'm not really sure that's true, but let's suppose it is. AI has helped researchers make progress on many other devilishly complex analysis problems, including genomics, climate science, and epidemiology. And so their argument is to throw AI at it. But to effectively adopt AI for neural data analysis, though, we must accept the bitter lesson, an idea first articulated by AI researcher Rich Sutton, a pioneer of reinforcement learning. In a 2019 blog post, Sutton observed that the most successful approaches in AI have been those that are sufficiently general, such that they continue to scale with increased computation. In other words, clever, bespoke solutions engineered to tackle specific problems tend to lose out to general purpose solutions that can be deployed at a massive scale of internet-sized data and brain-sized artificial networks. So you have trillions of data points and trillions of model parameters or synaptic weights. So basically, this is very much in the spirit of this data-driven approach to AI that we've seen ascendant since probably the late aughts or the early 2010s. So, we have these models, we have a lot of data, and we just can power through it, I guess. So, it's interesting that they mention that we have these complex systems, but then the solution is really just to power through it with better algorithms and more data. It's kind of interesting that they take that tack. I thought they were going to actually go more in the direction of using dynamical systems approaches, but that's not actually where they're going with this, at least as far as I can tell. Sutton suggested we need to recognize that the actual contents of minds are tremendously irredeemably complex. We should stop trying to find simple ways to think about the contents of minds, such as simple ways to think about space, objects, multiple agents, or symmetries. In other words, embrace complexity, which is, again, I think there could be just as many problems in embracing complexity, but then just using AI, because you're using AI or using a data-driven approach, and you're having to interpret the things that it finds. And, with proteins, with proteomics, it's a pretty straightforward computational problem, I think, in at least the way in which they're doing protein structure prediction. And, that's maybe a little bit different than what we're dealing with in the brain. So I don't know. That's just kind of my take on that. But, this is something that it's not the sort of the mainstream position. So as you can imagine, this has been pretty controversial at least in the way that it's been approached here. So we believe that the bitter lesson surely applies to neural data analysis as well. First, there is no reason we can see to think that neural data would somehow be an exception to the general trend observed across domains in AI. So the idea is that you could use AI to analyze neural data just as you can use AI to analyze any other type of data, which is kind of maybe in terms of generalization putting the cart before the horse, but I don't know. second, neural data is a clear candidate for the benefits of scale, precisely because it is so complex. If we are to embrace the complexity of neural data and to generalize to novel situations, then we must move towards a data-driven regime in which we employ large models trained on vast amounts of data. Indeed, there is an argument to be made that our inability to extract meaningful signals from complex neural data has held back progress on practical applications of neuroscience research. So, yeah, we don't have good methods for dealing with large amounts of data, or at least we haven't typically had large amounts of data in the past. We've typically been limited to single trial data, and when we've had large amounts of neuroimaging data, we've had to use methods that weren't basically large scale in nature. So that's kind of what they're getting at there. AI models trained at scale on these data could potentially unlock numerous downstream applications we have not even yet to even fully envision. So how do we unlock the full complexity of brain data and scale up our understanding of the mind? First, we need models that can make sense of multimodal data sets that combine electrophysiology, imaging, and behavior across different individuals, tasks, and species. So that, of course, is where they're kind of getting at this idea of taking data from different sources, different modes of like neuroimaging, different types of anatomical data, different types of behavioral data, and bringing it together across species, across tasks, across individuals, which of course is challenging to interpret as much as it is to bring together and to synthesize. So I think you need a theoretical component to this. I also think you would need to kind of maybe not do this sort of bulk analysis of things, because if you're analyzing across species, as we know from some of the work we've done in Diva Worm on cross-species analysis and comparative analysis, sometimes you're dealing with apples and oranges, and AI isn't just going to magically kind of work across those apples and oranges seamlessly. So it's an interesting point, but I think there's some caution there. Second, we need infrastructure and computational resources to power this transformation. We need maybe high performance computing, but also infrastructure that can handle the training and fine tuning of large generalist models. Finally, scaling demands data, lots of it. We need data sets, and we need to capture brain dynamics in natural, uncontrolled environments to fully reflect the richness and variability of brain function. So we need models, computing, and data. And they actually give a shout out here to some of the initiatives that are ongoing. So the International Brain Laboratory, the Allen Institute, the NIH's Brain Initiative, and then DANDY, which is the Open Data Repository. And then, so they go through some more points here, where we need robust global data archives, large-scale computing resources dedicated to training AI models on neural data, professional software developers, and data scientists. So this is the sort of thing where we have research software engineers, we have other types of open source developers who know how to manage open source projects, because these would have to be ostensibly open source because you're dealing with a lot of research labs and they can't afford to have things be proprietary. And we've talked about different ways to do that. And then, of course, having dedicated engineers and staff who can streamline data standardization and storage and help build AI models at scale. Okay, so they have responses here from different people. Conrad Cording gave a response. Louise Pessoa. Let's see. Terry Sajanowski. So let's see. Let's go to some of the. Let's go to Conrad's response. One of the most profound experiences of my life as a neuroscientist was following receptive field mapping experiments in the basement of the Institute of Neuroinformatics in Zurich. As he moved bright stripes in front of an animal's eyes, I could hear the activity of a neuron. It was active only when the stripe was in the right place, the neuron's receptive field. And so this gave us a model of how the visual system works. A set of neurons that extracts lines, a subsequent set that would extract curves, and after a few steps, a set of neurons that would recognize objects. This idea of the brain as a collection of simple specialized neurons grouped into brain areas was deeply influential for the field and me as well, giving rise to both leading theories in neuroscience and then the development of AI as a discipline. So over the years, however, we found that rather the specialized neurons cleanly extracting human understandable features, neurons are entangled in the web of multi-purpose context-dependent processing. So this idea that their simplicity in neuronal coding died on the rocks of reality. So there is this complexity, all right, but of course, like I said, there's this complexity in terms of interactions. And, AI is surprisingly good at describing high-dimensional heterogeneous neural data. And so, I guess he's kind of on board with the idea of AI, but not as a framework for understanding things. So, it's hard to find interpretable structure. Um, AI models have problems finding interpretable structure, and they don't really offer very much conceptual clarity. And that's maybe some of the problems that we run into with this kind of approach. Louise Pessoa, we've talked about with respect to dynamical approaches to neuroscience. He talks about this embrace of complexity, and he agrees with that. We're dealing with non-stationary, non-linear, stochastic, high-dimensional biological systems, but this raises critical considerations regarding their proposal to leverage AI. If we accept that the brain operates in a fundamentally context-dependent manner, perhaps even radically so, then capturing meaningful principles requires sampling from an extraordinarily vast space of possible states and computations. This presents both conceptual and practical challenges for any large-scale modeling approach. So, and its primary consideration is that current lab paradigms inadequately capture the rich dynamics observed in naturalistic environments. Though Dyer and Richards acknowledge this, I would push further. We need data from animals freely engaging in species-typical social interactions across multiple ecological contexts. The environments themselves must be sufficiently complex to allow meaningful bidirectional animal-environment interactions that mirror real-world dynamics. And then, of course, the other consideration or the other critique here involves the interpretation of multi-species data sets. So we should expect significant species differences in both organization and function. Even if you're looking across, say, primate brains or rodent brains, you have these different scales where there are meaningful functional differences. This does not diminish the value of comparative work, but rather demands we explicitly account for these differences in our theoretical frameworks and modeling approaches. So Terry Sajanowski considers this, kind of from his perspective of working on, he was one of the chairs, I think, of some of the NeuroAI sessions in the last NeuroAI workshop at the NIH. And this kind of he gives this sort of proposes this generative model of the brain where you have time series from fMRI, you have virtual reality as the stimulus, as the continuous stimulus, you have causal inference by causal cross-mapping, dimensionality reduction after causal compression, manifolds from attractor reconstruction, then a network of manifolds, and then manifolds simulate brain activity and generate behavior. So you have all these different tools kind of stacked together, these statistical tools, these analytical tools, bringing in time series data, continuous behavioral data, and then the ability to reconstruct the behavior from those data and those methods. So this is actually from a preprint here, Powell et al. Experimentally testable whole brain manifolds that recapitulate behaviors. This is from the arXiv in 2021. So yeah, this is a collaboration that Terry Sitchnowski did with Gerald Powell, the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology. Yeah, so that's that article. And then let's return to our chatbot here. And so NeuroPilot, I asked NeuroPilot about RAD and virtual reality, very non-engineered prompt. And so it gives me a number of these different models. Again, it gave me kind of similar models to the last question I asked. It was somewhat similar. It gives me Itzkovich 2003. And this, of course, is showing this scenario simulating the firing patterns of neurons as a rat navigates through various VR maze configurations. Here's the simulation, or the graph that shows the simulation. These are neural dynamics, electrophysiological dynamics, and then it gives the parameters for the simulation. So you plug this into an electrophysiological simulator and you get these parameters and you get these results. They give a structured response here. So summary of key simulation dynamics, comparison to typical neuronal behaviors, hypothesis on underlying mechanisms. So this is a large language model that's doing this. So like in the article, they were talking about throwing data at a model. In this case, we're throwing a prompt at a, basically, I guess, a database of information about computational neuroscience, neuroimaging, things like that. So this kind of gives some sort of structured response. It also provides this graph, and it gives parameters for running the simulation. So yeah, and then it just says, like, for the hypothesis, the observed patterns could be attributed to factors such as synaptic dynamics and ion channel properties. And so just giving these different scenarios here, the varied firing could indicate differing adaptations in excitatory and inhibitory populations, possibly driven by differential expression of ion channels like Kv1. And then the model's inhibitory weights, -0.5, suggests a strong counterbalance by inhibitory neurons, critical for maintaining network stability despite high excitation. This balance might mimic the real cortical architectures, where inhibition tightly regulates excitation to refine signal processing during complex tasks such as spatial navigation. So they just give like plausible scenarios for things that a rat might do in VR, and they try to simulate those. What's a current base network is simulating small network dynamics in response to virtual reality stimuli. These are the parameters for this simulation, and the image is loading here. But there's a spike raster plot and a spike heat map. So the analysis, they talk about the agreement and deviation between the reference data from the Cuba model and the simulation, mechanistic explanations, and model assessment. So this is the graph's really kind of slow in loading, but basically you can see that we have this raster plot and heat map that it's generating. So it's just generating this sort of example of what the data should look like. And then I think this is I don't know what this model, I'm not familiar with this model, but it's analyzing oscillatory activity in neural circuits during virtual treadmill movements. and it's just showing the membrane potential versus time for the initial phase and the adapted phase. So it's like during the virtual treadmill movement, before they start using a treadmill, and then after. And then here are the simulation parameters, and then a summary of key observations. So for the initial phase, the adapted phase, and the characteristics of different neurons, the ABPD neurons, the LP neurons, and the PY neurons for each. And then the interpretation of network dynamics and the mechanistic hypotheses. So the mechanistic hypotheses are synaptic plasticity, ion channel modulation, neuromodulatory effects. And then the research directions are functional implications, and then research directions. So it kind of gives you some, kind of food for thought in terms of how to design an experiment, how it fits into the literature. Actually, I didn't really talk about the literature too much, but they kind of give explanations. They provide hypotheses to test and things like that. So that was an interesting set of things. Thank you, Morgan, for posting on the NeuroPilot, trying that out, seeing what it was like. And then, yeah, that transmitter article was really interesting. I thought it was quite an interesting approach, or interesting kind of take on it, and then seeing what other people thought. I'm not quite sold on the idea of using AI as the way forward. I think we need a lot more thinking about sort of dynamical systems approaches and other types of things. And then, I think that maybe a role for AI would be more suited to something like what we saw with NeuroPilot, where you have, maybe even a higher level type of model where you have these theoretical insights characterized. And then you can move forward and say, oh yeah, this sort of thing happens in these species, or this sort of phenomena happens in this set of individuals, and be able to do these kinds of things where you can more easily target populations or species or specific pathways. And I think that would work better. Not really sure what they're expecting, by kind of dumping everything into what I'm assuming is some sort of discriminant model or generative model, and then getting something out of it. I guess it's like a cool insight, which you might possibly be wrong, it might possibly be right. We have no way of knowing. I guess you're supposed to validate it with experiments later, but that's kind of expensive in a lot of ways. So, did we have any questions on any of that or comments? A couple of comments in the chat. Okay, yeah. Let's see.
Hi. Yeah, I was saying I think I missed the intro of what neuropilot.chat is.
What is it?
Yeah, like is it like something developed by INCF or?
I'm not sure what group put this out, but this is basically, it's a large language model where you, that you prompt it with something. You prompt it with something from the neuroscience literature, and then like you'll ask it a question like, "What happens in the brain during a psychedelic trip? Or can a neural network sustain activity without input?" And let me see if they have. They don't. Yeah, they don't really have any information about the group here, but it's basically just a way to create and explore what they call neurosimulations, which is essentially kind of, you ask it a question, it gives you a bunch of models that it tests or it simulates based on your question. So it has to find kind of the things that are involved in the question you're asking, and then it presents the data I guess it does some of the simulations. Like in this example where we were showing, it does the timing dependent plasticity simulation. It, gives you the plot, so it shows you what the data should look like, and then it gives you maybe some little bit of interpretation. That's basically what it is.
Yeah, it's very cool.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So last week we talked about a number of things. We did talk about the brain networks, and we took two different approaches to that. We talked about brain networks as sort of this active inference approach to brain networks, where you can use Bayesian models. And then we also had this other approach to brain networks. And so, we were contrasting and comparing those. We also talked about large language models and reasoning, and we have a whole series of discussions on that going back to about the beginning of this year. So the last several meetings we've talked about this topic, and we've been pulling up readings on it and kind of going through how people are incorporating reasoning and concepts into large language models. So what we saw with NeuroPilot was kind of, just a general large language model. I don't think there's a reasoning step in it, but you can see where, reasoning can be very useful in a model. And so, yeah, this is a developing area, and we'll see where that goes. But I did promise last week, because I did bring up in the course of talking about large language model reasoning, talking about diffusion models and flow matching and that sort of thing. So that's what I'd like to talk about now. So I pulled together some readings. There was a reading from last week where they had a chapter on diffusion models, but we're going to kind of talk about we're going to go over some other resources on this. So some of these are kind of very high level, so I don't want to, I'm not going to try to get into too much of the research. I'm just going to get into some. So a couple of these are, kind of these things that are put out by startups, so they might be a little bit advertising oriented. We'll see. This is Introduction to Diffusion Models for Machine Learning. This is from Assembly AI. So this talks about, the meteoric rise of diffusion models is one of the biggest developments in machine learning in the past several years. Learn everything you need to know about diffusion models in this easy to follow guide. So this is Ryan O'Connor, the senior developer educator for Assembly AI. So diffusion models are generative models which have been gaining significant popularity in the past several years, and for good reason. A handful of seminal papers released in the 2020s alone have shown the world what diffusion models are capable of, such as beating generative adversarial models or GANs on image synthesis. Most recently, practitioners will have seen diffusion models used in DALL-E 2, OpenAI's image generation models released last month. So this is a little bit dated, but basically this is the DALL-E 2. These are examples where it's producing these generative images, and it's using a diffusion model to do this. So given the recent wave of success by diffusion models, many practitioners are surely interested in their inner workings. So in this article, they examine the theoretical foundations and then demonstrate how to generate images with the diffusion model toolbox in PyTorch. So the introduction is that diffusion models are generative models, meaning that they are used to generate data similar to the data on which they are trained. So they're taking training data and they're recovering it in some way, or some similar way. Fundamentally, diffusion models work by destroying training data through the successive addition of Gaussian noise, and then learning to recover the data by reversing this noising process. So you can see here in this picture, they have a training image of someone's face. They use Gaussian noise, which is just like this sort of static that you see here, to obscure the image. And the idea is you degrade the image quality and you provide the algorithm with these successively masked images so that the model can learn what it looks like when there's incomplete information. So you randomly ablate the data points in the image. You randomly degrade the features. And in doing so, it can learn a wider range of features. It can learn how the feature sort of is decomposed, I guess, or how it can lose information. So if you're looking at a partial image or something that's very fuzzy, the diffusion model would then be better suited to recover that because it's seen things like that before. So you noise the training data and then you denoise that training data through recovering an image that looks similar. So after training, we can use the diffusion model to generate data by simply passing randomly sampled noise through the learn denoising process. So this is where we have the example. We don't get it from static, we get it from an image that's been masked by noise or static, and then we have recover an image that looks like the original. More specifically, a diffusion model is a latent variable model which maps to the latent space using a fixed Markov chain. This chain gradually adds noise to the data in order to obtain the solution. So this is the Markov chain here. Let me zoom in. So our Markov chain starts at x0, which is the training data, the fully unnoised training data. Then we have xt minus 1. Then we have xt, which is the noised version, and then xt, which is the noise, capital T, and then we end up with, so we have this noise data. We go from the training, unnoised training data to this chain of progressive noising. And we end up with an image that's basically totally obscured by noise. So ultimately, the image is asymptotically transformed to pure Gaussian noise, as we see in X capital T here. The goal of training a diffusion model is to learn the reverse process. In other words, you're training this equation here, you're training this process here. You're training that into the model. By transversing backwards along this chain, we can generate new data. So for Q, we have Q here, which is the function of noising. And then P here, which is the function of denoising. So you're basically going backwards now from total noise X capital T and recovering the image slowly, extracting features out of the noise until you reach the recovered image X0, which is similar to this X0, but it's been recovered. So you're trying to reverse this process of training. By traversing backwards along this chain, we can generate new data. Okay, so that's basically how it works. You have this training data, you're noising it, you're teaching the algorithm how to identify degraded images or images that are asymptotically close to pure noise, and then you're recovering that and generating some similar image. So there are a number of benefits of these diffusion models. So as mentioned above, research into diffusion models have exploded in recent years. They're actually inspired by non-equilibrium thermodynamics, which is, I'm not going to get into the papers on that, but this is something that we actually featured in our paper on the Evergood regulator theorem, working through some examples of diffusion models and the Evergood regulator theorem. So there is this link between diffusion models and physics and even cybernetics. Diffusion models currently produce state-of-the-art image quality, examples of which can be seen below. So these are the images generated by a diffusion model. Beyond cutting-edge image quality, diffusion models come with a host of other benefits, including not requiring adversarial training. So in GANs, Of course, we have adversarial training. We need to teach the model both about the training data set and then adversarial images so that it can distinguish between the actual type of image and then counter examples or counterfactuals, basically. So it helps the model learn about reasoning a little bit and causality. In this case, you don't have causality, you have this sort of noise-driven approach where you're teaching it about how an image could look if it were, obscured with noise. And so you're teaching it sort of counterfactuals in that sense. Never wouldn't really be considered a counterfactual in the same way, but it's teaching it something about some other properties of the training set. It's not teaching it the training set as a sort of idealized set of information. Okay. And this is good because the difficulties of adversarial training are well documented, and in cases where non-adversarial alternatives exist with comparable performance and training efficiency, it is usually best to utilize them. On the topic of training efficiency, diffusion models also have the added benefit of scalability and parallelizability. So diffusion models scale up well, and they can also be parallelized on supercomputers. So you can build like a parallel processing algorithm where you can split your job up into different parts and run them. While diffusion models almost seem to be producing results out of thin air, there are a lot of careful and interesting mathematical choices and details that provide the foundation for these results. And best practices are still evolving in the literature. Okay, so then they're going to talk about the mathematical theory. So, as mentioned, a diffusion model consists of a forward process or a diffusion process. So the training image is diffused in noise. So it's just diffusion means that you're moving away from order. So you're diffusing. And then which a datum generating image is progressively noised. So that's the forward process, this diffusion process. And then there's a reverse process or a reverse diffusion process in which noise is transformed back into a sample from the target distribution. So you're recovering that image, you're recovering that distribution of the original image. So it's not the original image that you're actually just kind of reconstructing. You're reconstructing the target distribution and you're generating an image from that. So it's very similar, but it's not exactly the same. But it's good enough for a lot of applications. So you have this forward process, a reverse process is diffusion, and then reverse diffusion. The sampling chain transitions, which we saw with P and Q, we saw those Markovian transitions, in the forward process can be set to conditional Gaussians where the noise level is sufficiently low. So we saw some conditional probabilities in there in the Gaussian chain calculations. And so that's what we're doing with these conditional Gaussians, where we, can try different levels of noise. So, it's not enough just to say we're going to add some noise. There's a strategy here, and you have to have like these steps where you're introducing progressively more noise. If the model can pick up on that transition, then it's more likely to work than if you just give it like an image half obscured by noise and then noise. It's not going to have enough transitional information to kind of follow through so it can see that how the features are being obscured, because it's random noise just generating it over random parts of the image. So you're getting, features that are obscured in different ways and progressively so until you have features that are not really recognizable. And so if the model can see that in the training process, in the forward process, it has a better chance of recovering it during the reverse process. Combining this fact with the Markov assumption leads to a simple parameterization of the forward process. Okay. So as mentioned previously, the magic of diffusion models comes in the reverse process. During training, the model learns to reverse this diffusion process in order to generate new data. Starting with the pure Gaussian noise, the model learns the joint distribution, and then, where you have two time-dependent parameters of the Gaussian transitions are learned. Note in particular that the Markov formulation asserts that a given reverse diffusion transition distribution depends only on the previous time step or following time step. So if you have, as you're recovering the image from noise, you have these different transition time steps. So if you have a transition distribution, you're going from the previous time step to the next time step. And you're doing this, you're generating transition distributions for each time step, and it's changing as you go along. So this is why, again, you need to have this, you need to have this significant transition period where you can go from point to point, and you can't expect to recover it in 2 steps or 3 steps. It might have to be 20 or 30 steps. The same goes for the forward, the noising process. Okay. Then they talk about training. A diffusion model is trained by finding the reverse Markov transitions. And then they talk about KL divergence, which of course is something that we use in looking, for looking at differences between things. So you're trying to understand this through the KL divergence of a varying distribution or reference distribution. So the way you know that you've recovered the image is that you have this initial distribution and a recovered distribution. And you can calculate the KL divergence between these two distributions. And so this is kind of what they're getting at. So there's this KL divergence of P from Q at any given moment. And so actually the P and Q are the transition distributions. So as you're noising the image and denoising the image, you can see the difference between those. And of course, that's going to result in the efficacy of the forward and the backwards noising process. Okay. So I think that's enough in that article. This is another one here. This is the Panoramic Guide to Diffusion Models in Machine Learning. Zoom in a little bit. And this is AI Education. I'm not sure exactly where this is from, but this is written by Oksana Zadrak. And this talks a little bit about diffusion models. So again, diffusion models are cutting edge technologies that generate and transform data in ways we once thought were exclusive to human creativity. So talking about diffusion models being a type of generative model. In physics, diffusion is a natural process where particles spread out in a medium from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower, until a kind of equilibrium is reached. Machine learning models use a similar process to create content. Imagine you have a photo and you're gradually adding a kind of digital fog to it, making it less and less clear until it's just random, or until it's just a random, unrecognizable pattern. In machine learning, we call this fog noise. So this is where this noising process, you're basically just adding some obfuscation to the image. This is diffusing across the entire image until the entire image is filled with the same level of noise. Diffusion models for machine learning work in reverse. They start with this randomness and gradually remove the noise, called denoising step by step, following a specific set of rules to create something structured and coherent like an image. And so this is basically talking about how you remove the noise, and that's really the key part of this. Let's see. So there are different types of diffusion models. There's the improved denoising diffusion probabilistic models. And so this is based on the original DDPM. These improved models offer enhancements that often result in faster training times and improved quality of generated samples. Guided diffusion models. These models allow for more control over the generation process. Users can guide the output towards desired characteristics or attributes. Conditional diffusion models are particularly useful in applications where the output needs to be conditioned on certain inputs. This is good for tasks like text-to-image generation. And then latent diffusion models. By operating in a latent space rather than directly in the data space, these models can offer computational efficiencies that sometimes generate higher quality outputs for certain applications. So this is where you have these different types of diffusion models that deviate from the original kind of model that we saw in the first article. So this is what are stable diffusion models. And so, we're familiar with the stable diffusion platform. So stable diffusion models are specific subsets of diffusion models. They share the foundational principles of diffusion models for machine learning, but are different in a number of ways. So while diffusion models can be used for a variety of data types, stable diffusion models are specifically fine-tuned for image generation. They excel at creating detailed and contextually relevant images based on textual prompts, offering a wide range of creative possibilities. The term stable suggests a focus on consistency and reliability in the generated outputs. These models are engineered to produce coherent and visually appealing images that closely adhere to the input descriptions, which I assume means that there's some sort of diffusion process, but then it's linked to labels and some sort of semantic content. So, yeah, this doesn't really give a lot of technical information as much as the last article. So, yeah, and so they talk about Midjourney. Is Midjourney a diffusion model? Midjourney is an independent research lab that has developed an AI system known for generating images. While the specific technical details of Midjourney's underlying model are not as publicly documented or transparent as compared to other AI models like DALL-E or Stable Diffusion, which are diffusion models, it probably involves techniques like diffusion models. So again, this is your diffusion model. You have this image of a cat, and you have the cat being progressively noised to this random static or noise, this Gaussian noise. And then you're denoising, going backwards, recovering the image to something that looks like the cat. And this process has a distribution or a series of distributions, and you can calculate the difference between the noising and denoising distributions with KL divergence. And you have ways that you can optimize this entire process to improve performance. So again, we have forward diffusion, reverse diffusion, final output. And of course, the training data is very important. You need to have a good generalizable data set. You need maybe to have labels in your data set. And you need to pre-process your data set in a number of ways that will enable this, because this process is dependent, of course, on good quality images. If you already have noisy images, this noising process doesn't help you very much. It gives you maybe a little bit more. Well, it doesn't give you as much. If you had a cat and images of a cat that were like low res, or maybe they had some noise, they were masked with some noise already, it would be very hard to use this process to improve upon that. It would probably decrement your performance. So, there are a number of caveats with diffusion modeling and diffusion processes. But it's a nice approach inspired by statistical physics and thermodynamic methods. So it looks like we lost Jesse, but gained Amirhossain. Welcome, Amirhossain. And Morgan has his camera on, so I don't know, Morgan.
Good morning.
Hi.
Just listening along.
Oh yeah.
I partly because it's my background, but I think it's always helpful to look at some concrete examples of these diffusion models, and brain imaging. Brain imaging is one of those great domains where you've got a lot of people kind of working on the frontier on with these kind of data sets, and so you get to see in practice like what these kind of different diffusion models give you in terms of we've got this very large data set of UK Biobank MRI structural images. What do we get out of that by running diffusion models? Like what goals could you possibly set, and then which particular diffusion variant is most appropriate, and then that can be really helpful. I think the way that just that. So like, is it for synthetic data generation, or is it for some particular understanding of group differences or something like that? Like again, it can be useful to see it in the context of one problem.
Right.
Or a couple problems that are from the same domain, right? Like there's a number of different kind of problems or tasks that you might want to accomplish with brain imaging data. So it's is it you've got a big pile of data and you're trying to understand some structures in it, or you've got one volume of data and you want to understand where it lies in the greater distribution, or like and then these some of these descriptions can be, it helps to concretize what these different modeling techniques are doing or can offer.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Oh, it does. Yeah. I think it's interesting to see. I've not seen a lot of. I've seen a lot of study, or I haven't seen any studies where people kind of look at like these methods in terms of, what kinds of input images do we want to use, and maybe not so much performance, but like maybe like things where you simulate that, that noising and denoising process, and see how efficient it is outside of the realm of like the machine learning technique. So a lot of, you can do a lot of experiments with like looking at noise and how it obscures an image. We were doing some work with that in DivaWorm with Perlin noise. We were obscuring a biomedical image with noise and recovering the information from that. So it's like you can play around with all sorts of noise, not just Gaussian noise, but nonlinear noise and other things that, kind of sometimes it provides information, but most of the time it degrades information. And so what does that look like in terms of the information that's there, that's being obscured, and that's being recovered? So
for sure. Like I know for like my PhD work, I found that the group statistics in images had an interesting noise distribution that was that we weren't accounting for. It was like in gamma distribution. So it was kind of poissonage. And yeah, again, one of those things where it was like, it was only, you wouldn't see it in a single image, but it was when you're putting these large multi-subject data sets together. And yeah, I haven't, so I mentioned brain imaging, but I haven't been keeping up in terms of how those are being applied. I remember, when stable diffusion was the hot, AI technique, or
for the week that it was.
are they still a company?
I don't think stable diffusion is, but that was like a fork of another project, and there are a bunch of forks of stable diffusion, so I don't think it's like gone.
Stability
AI was the one.
Yeah. No, of course. That certainly went through its own iterations. Right?
Yeah.
Like, that had a lot of drama around it. Yeah, like wasn't David Ha at Stability AI?
Maybe, yeah.
I think he was. I think he was for a short time. Anyway, it would be good to see, the nice thing is that, brain imaging does have this, at least this one data set. It's UK Biobank, where you kind of like, because you still need a lot of data, right? Or to hopefully find generalizations that become population, that can address your population. You've got a lot of data. Anyway, it would be good to see what presentations are coming up on this, and to human brain mapping. That'll be like in June.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't have any. Don't have any diffusion modeling in any of our pipelines at this time.
Yeah. What did you think about the article I talked about, the better lesson article?
Well, yeah. Come on, Bradley. AI is going to save us all.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I certainly like. Who did the recent, like, it was like a play on the the unreasonable effectiveness, but it was like something about the incredible difficulty of biological data.
Right. Yeah.
Like, I like, the brain is biology.
Right.
So that's the part where I'm just like, that is something that should be addressed.
Right.
I mean, it's especially to counter, again, like when people say that neural network researchers are working on the brain, and it's just like, no, they're not.
Right.
They're doing glorified linear algebra.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Like, there is something. There's something to that in terms of this idea that even, say, spiking neural networks are capturing brain activity, right?
Yeah.
Is incredibly, is an incredible simplification and abstraction there. And so it's nice when when people are writing that, because, well, again, this is coming from someone who cares a lot about physiological psychiatry, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, kind of embracing that complexity.
Right.
But yeah, whether AI will quickly become the cognitive filter that we can use to just suddenly see, you do an AI filter pass and suddenly all this all is revealed. Well, you will see. The Foresight is doing a meeting in I think it's in May, like AI X bio. No, this is. I mean, Ben Blazek. I think we've talked about him before. I think he's at Argonne National Lab, kind of close to you. Chemistry, material science is going to have the breakthroughs first, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like if it comes out, it's going to come out in something like chemistry first, right? and the unreasonable complexity of biology will remain, mysterious for a while.
Yeah.
Who wrote that? The transmitter?
Oh, that article was Ava Dyer and Blake Richards. So Blake Richards.
Oh, okay.
Was
okay.
Probably.
Those are good. Those are good people.
Yeah.
Or yeah. That makes me yeah.
I mean, yeah. I think Blake Richards is known for taking controversial takes. So I don't know. But yeah, this is. I mean, I guess it's maybe like a discussion, like food for thought. You have articles that are sometimes just like, let's put something out there and see what people think.
Yeah.
Generate controversy and or
Well, it's time that they're all together right now in Montreal.
Oh yeah.
Right, for cosine. So, hopefully they're talking about the complexity. It's great. I love that meeting for they're streaming everything.
Okay. This is currently happening.
Yeah. I think this started the 27th. I mean, I don't know if it was just, they might have just done the opening ceremony on the 27th, but I think it started yesterday.
Oh wow, that's something we should check out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, so cosines right now and Cognitive Neuroscience Society.
Okay. Yeah.
Which is still a biggie. But I'm trying to and and again, like I think of cosine as the successor to NeuroPilot,
right.
because because it's been so taken over by these people who think that the brain is just a neural network.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And yeah. So again, I'm so old. I can remember when NeuroPilot was kind of a brain meeting, or at least had some had more cosine-ish kind of stuff.
Right.
Anyway, I met my advisor up at Whistler.
Yeah.
I saw that, and then somebody was just posting in AirTech Slack about the BCI Society meeting. which is going to be at Banff this year. So I think that's every other year.
Yeah.
Anyway, but it was making me think about these meetings that are in ski resorts.
Yeah.
You know, and it's you know, I would, when I was in radiology, like the continuing education for radiologists, they would always have like, you know, continuing education in radiology this year in Costa Rica.
Yeah.
like, is that why it's there?
Yeah.
Like, I think you guys are just justifying the trip, but
right.
I'm trying to think things this week. Any good meetings? Lots of good talks. Lots of good brain imaging talks. I gotta put together a calendar that just covers the the good meetings, and you know, especially the ones that that also produce a video file afterwards. But I've I got to do that. A lot of good progress on organoid development. You know, like really hoping this new, you know, the biolab's gonna get to move into this, you know, 4,000 square foot floor. I'm really, and they've asked me to you know, basically pitch a neurofloor together with the Foresight Institute.
Oh wow!
So that was really awesome. So Tuesday we met with and Tuesday Vitalik Buterin, you know, the founder of Ethereum, came by. I have nothing to say about cryptocurrency, or you know, but all these people seem to have ideas about postmodern society. I don't know. I'll try and keep my classical liberal arts education to myself.
Yeah.
Well, that together with my mother, you know, as a sociologist and urban planner, and dealing with Anyway, it's like okay, I've had too many discussions growing up with her. But you know, like terrific to see that kind of support, in the sense that like they put me in touch with Foresight Institute, and you know, whose bio speakers I love, you know. So Foresight Institute's got Ed Boyden speaking April 1st. Interestingly, Boyden's talk is titled "Computer Simulations of the Brain."
Oh wow!
Which you know, I that is not what I think of him as being one to do. Yeah, you can check out his, you know, for the students here, the I think his blog is he synthetic
biology?
Syntheticbiology.org.
That's his main. Well, it could be the address of the lab. I don't know, but
I think it's synthetic. No, I'm just trying to make it into .com. Yeah, interesting. Syntheticbiology.org switches to syntheticbiology.com.
Oh.
Interesting. Okay, I don't know who's got that, but anyway, I'll check the email in terms of what that is. But
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah. Anyway, I'll find that and put it in the chat. Sorry.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah. Yeah. Why don't we return to the now? I have to talk about flow matching. I talked about diffusion models, and so I have some other resources around flow matching. This is from the arXiv. This is from December of 2024. And this is flow matching guide and code. So this is from a group working on flow matching and kind of giving this, creating this library. This is, I guess, associated with Meta, Facebook research or Meta research. And then they're doing this flow matching and they have this resource. So flow matching is a recent framework for generative modeling that has achieved state-of-the-art performance across various domains, including image, video, audio, speech, and biological structures. So it's multimodal data, multimodal model. This guide offers a comprehensive and self-contained review of flow matching, covering its mathematical foundations, design choices, and extensions, by also providing a PyTorch package featuring relevant examples, image and text generation examples. This work aims to serve as a resource for both novice and experienced researchers interested in understanding, applying, and further developing flow matching. So they have this flow matching library on GitHub, and this kind of goes over some of the code that you can use to implement this. So it isn't as prevalent as diffusion modeling in terms of, where we can find it in the startup space or whatever, but it's definitely also inspired by physics. Actually, it's inspired by different types of topological mathematics and things like that. So we have flow models, which are random vectors, conditional densities and expectations, diffeomorphisms, and push-forward maps using mathematical tools, and then modeling flows as generative models, having these probability paths, instantaneous change of variables, and then training flow models. And then they have flow models and flow matching, where you're building probability paths, deriving generated velocity fields, calculating flow matching loss, solving conditional generation with conditional flows, optimal transport and linear conditional flow, affine conditional flows, and data couplings. And then you have these non-Euclidean flow matching approaches, continuous time Markov chain models, discrete flow matching, so for the discrete case, and then the continuous time Markov process model case. So you have the continuous and discrete cases, generator matching, relation to diffusion and other denoising models. So there's this relationship between diffusion models and denoising, and then additional proofs. So I'm going to go to maybe a more accessible example in a minute, but I wanted to go down to this relation to diffusion and other denoising models. So in this section, we finally discussed the relation to denoising diffusion models, or DDMs, and related models on non-Euclidean spaces. We mainly focus here on the construction of diffusion models then they give this reference, Song et al. 2021, and explain how it can be placed within the FMGM family of models, flow matching family of models. At the end of this section, we also discuss models and other modalities that took inspiration from DDMs or denoising models, and how can they be framed as GM models. So time conversion, so the first simple difference between denoising diffusion models and flow matching is a difference how time is parameterized. So this is just the convention, but it's important to avoid confusion. As opposed to flow matching, time is inverted in diffusion models in ranges from 0 to infinity. To differentiate the two time parameterizations, let us use R for the time convention of diffusion models and T for the time convention of flow matching, So we have flow matching time, which is t. Noise is equivalent to t equals 0. Data is equivalent to t equals 1. So this is where you go from noise to data in this flow matching. And then diffusion time is r, where noise is equivalent to r equals plus infinity, and data equals r, or is equivalent to r equals 1 or 0. So you have data being a value of 0, noise being plus infinity, because you're adding noise to the data and then recovering it. And then reparameterization there are these terms here, so you can reparameterize the model. The underlying idea of denoising diffusion is to construct a forward process that corrupts the data distribution. And so this corresponds to a specific construction of a probability path as used in flow matching. So in flow matching, instead of using this forward Markov process, you're using this probability path in flow matching. So I guess what you're doing is you're working with flows. You're working with the metaphor of flows, and you're trying to find a path from noise to the image. And so this is the equation here, where Q is the data distribution, WR is a Brownian motion, and there's a velocity field also called drift in the context of SDEs, and then a diffusion coefficient. So I guess these are stochastic differential equations they're working with. And then every such SDE defines a conditional probability path and marginal probability path. In these terms, where on the second line we parameterize time into the flow matching time parameterization. So this forward process is constructed that for r much greater than 0, the distribution of XR is approximately a Gaussian. So basically they're working, it's very similar to denoising diffusion models. You're just following a path through a flow. So that's kind of the relationship between the two. You're training a diffusion model. We now discuss how we can recover the training algorithm of diffusion models as a special case of flow matching training. In section 4.8, we discuss several options for how to parameterize and train a flow matching model with Gaussian probability paths. So you're using Gaussian probability paths instead of these forward chains or forward noising, discrete noising training sessions. So you're trying to work through this flow. You have these Gaussian probability paths, and you can use a number of different methods for that. And then, of course, you have sampling, and just like in the diffusion model, sampling is important. And you have ODE and SDE sampling. So you have ordinary differential equation sampling, and then stochastic differential equation sampling. And that gives you this, the different conditions. Then you have the role of time reversal in the backwards process. So to finish our discussion of diffusion models, we discussed the role of time reversal in the backward process in the context of diffusion models. Given how central the idea of time reversal is for diffusion models, it might seem surprising to some readers that it is not needed for flow matching. We explain this, therefore, here in more detail. Specifically to generate data, the diffusion model frame training is learned as a backwards process, going from 0 to r is greater than 0, such that this equation. Once we found such a process, we can initialize with a Gaussian to obtain a sample from the data distribution. And so, in other words, we want the stochastic process x bar r to generate the probability path p bar r. So we have the stochastic process, we have this probability path that gets generated from that, and we end up with this with flow matching. But this is exactly what we're trying to do in generator matching for general Markov processes, and in particularly flow matching with flows. So the Markov process in diffusion models is similar to what we're doing with flow matching and flows. So that's kind of giving us, and then we can use tools like Fokker-Planck equations to find, because when you're dealing with flows, you have a number of tools available to you, differential equations and other types of estimators. So that's the difference between those two. And let me go to this other article here. This is an arXiv paper from 2023. This is flow matching for generative modeling. And I think this is maybe the same group from Meta AI. So this is the paper. I think it may be an earlier version of this work, but anyways. We introduce a new paradigm for generative modeling built on continuous normalizing flows, or CNFs, allowing us to train CNFs at an unprecedented scale. Specifically, we present the notion of flow matching, a simulation-free approach for training CNFs based on regressing vector fields of fixed conditional probability paths. So you have these probability paths that you're following, and so flow matching is compatible with the general family of Gaussian probability paths for transforming between noise and data samples, which subsumes existing diffusion paths as specific instances. Interestingly, we find that employing flow matching or with diffusion paths results in a more robust and stable alternative for training diffusion models. So this is sort of another alternate way to train diffusion models. It's a more robust and stable alternative to the Markov model approach that we use. So they're using more continuous methods like stochastic differential equations and other tools from the study of fluid dynamics and flows. Furthermore, flow matching opens the door to training CNFs with other non-diffusion probability paths. An instance of particular interest is using optimal transport displacement interpolation to define the conditional probability paths. These paths are more efficient than diffusion paths, providing faster training and sampling and result in better generalization. So optimal transport, so it's picking up on the structure of the flows and it's using that information. So, with diffusion, you're just using a stochastic approach where, you're kind of recovering things from, you're working with a lot of, basically noise, a random noise. In this case, you're able to actually kind of use methods to your advantage. Training CNFs using flow matching and ImageNet leads to consistently better performance than alternative diffusion-based methods in terms of both likelihood and sample quality, and allows fast and reliable sample generation using off-the-shelf numerical ODE solvers. So theoretically, we should be able to do this work with the tools that exist in some of these cognate areas. So deep generative models are a class of deep learning algorithms aimed at estimating and sampling from an unknown data distribution. So we're working with, however, the restriction to simple diffusion processes leads to a rather confined space of sampling probability paths, resulting in very long training times and the need to adopt specialized methods for efficient sampling. So in this work, we consider the general and deterministic framework of continuous normalizing flows. CNFs are capable of modeling arbitrary probability paths and are in particular known to encompass the probability paths modeled by diffusion processes. However, aside from diffusion that can be trained efficiently, such as denoising square matching, no scalable CNF training algorithms are known. Indeed, maximum likelihood training require expensive numerical ODE simulations, while existing simulation-free methods either involve intractable integrals or bias gradients. The goal of this work is to propose flow matching, an efficient simulation-free approach to training CNF models. So this is where the motivation for this is coming from and how it's improving upon some of these other methods. So basically using continuous methods in diffusion models leads to these sort of problems with tractability, and so they're kind of introducing flow matching as a way around that. Importantly, flow matching breaks the barriers for scalable CNF training beyond diffusion and sidesteps the need to reason about diffusion processes to directly work with probability paths. So basically, they're using ImageNet 128 samples on a CNF trained using flow matching with optimal transport probability paths. So this is their data set. They're able to recover these images with this technique. Let me check the chat. Okay. Morgan put a YouTube link in. What was the YouTube link?
Oh, that's just that's cosine going on right now.
Oh, okay.
That's like yeah. Just anyway, this is you can it's live, or they're live now. I think that's like a reinforcement learning talk.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
We'll check that out. Yeah.
And SynNeuro is Ed Boyden's lab.
Okay. SynNeuro.
I was thinking SynBio. Like our lab is SynBio. I mean, Celsius is SynBio, but Ed actually thinks about neurons.
Right.
That's which is good. Which is good.
Yeah.
But I don't think I've seen him do. I can't think of any computational projects that he's been involved in. And I mean, especially that include biology. Like Michael Levin, I can think of, those Betsy projects.
Yeah.
Like bioelectricity. So very, very curious. And he was another one of these people like Elliot at Celsius, who was invited to Honduras for this these people with a lot of crypto trying to gather scientists, and Ed Boyden was there.
Yeah.
But I couldn't think of Elliot and I were trying to think of something that would be of interest to him, but his work is so great. I mean, it's so such advanced kind of material science, or just thinking of like the expansion microscopy.
Yeah.
There was a great who did that presentation? Oh yeah, it was Niv Gol. I'll have a look. But there was a Global Neurotech Summit Friday, put on by the student clubs of UPenn and Imperial College. Although for some reason it seemed to have a lot of Yale students running it. But a nice presentation of transcranial temporal interference electrical stimulation, which is also a Boyden technique. It's like an original 2016 paper, but the reason I mention it is that it's something that Flip Sabies had said, who's got a new implant company. So this is like a former Neuralink co-founder. All the co-founders have their own companies now because they've all left. That it's not a phase array technique, and that it's more I want to try and get this talk in terms of better explaining the Boyden what they call TITES, temporal interference.
Yeah.
Anyway, but sorry, I interrupted.
It's okay. Yeah, did we have any other comments or questions about the flow matching part of this?
I mean, again, I think that's cool, that I just, I would want to play with the PyTorch and see what we can get from it, or like, again, I was just doing a quick a little quick search and kind of UK biobank diffusion, flow matching kinds of things, and my advisor is kind of leads the brain imaging of UK biobank, so it's also good to see what they're doing. So a lot of it's focused on making a spatial template, as you can imagine, for from all that population level data, because we've never had kind of 30,000 MRI scans all collected the same way before, and the design of a spatial template is a super important, super important for imaging studies, especially imaging studies that are actually going to be a low number of subjects. Bringing them into a common space is a really interesting image normalization problem, spatial normalization problem. Yeah. And with these nonlinear techniques in particular, it becomes a very interesting problem of you can make the images match, right? You can bring them into exactly the same space, but then you've destroyed the individuality of those brains, right?
Right.
And so that is the tension you have in spatial normalization. Does everybody have good access to GPUs currently?
It's not a good access. I have the laptop that I done my GSOC project on. It's a RTX 3090 Ti. It's a good enough GPU, but the problem is it only has 4 GB of space. So, I remember that I could get 7 billion, 8 billion parameter models on it, but anything more than that would not fit because of the space.
Yeah. Have you worked much with Google Cloud?
I not with cloud. I've worked with Collab and the Collab GPUs, on the Pro plan. But even they were we had to do a project in college where we needed really good access to GPUs. So we tried Google Cloud, and it was not that, because it used to get disconnected very quickly. And the thing is, when it gets disconnected, you lose everything. So you lose all the progress so far. I think there is a way to go through Google Cloud and TPU as well, but I'm not sure. It is what happens is, so you have data saved into your drive. You can connect your drive to Google Colab, and what you can keep doing is, if you're training a model, so you can keep periodically saving back the weights to your drive. So that will be safe. But if you're running, even sometimes with very heavy models, even if you're running inference, and in the middle of running inference, if it stops, then you can't, you have to start again. And it's there were some problems with that. But so what we ended up doing for our project was, we wanted to do something we basically wanted to do stable diffusion itself. So we ended up using, we basically used stable diffusion to create sprites of, we were working in something related to game development. So we wanted to make sprites of characters, of game characters. So for that, we use Stable Diffusion, and we use like a startup website itself that like kind of gave us access to its cloud. And basically, like, it had the model hosted there itself, and it had its own servers, and you would pay like by the amount of like tokens you wanted to use, so it wasn't that expensive, and we were able to like query and like use the models from there. So if you're looking for something like that, I can guide you there. Even with
yeah.
go ahead.
I mean, I'm fighting with Google Cloud right now.
Yeah, Google Cloud is like.
Yeah.
What's your exact use case though? Like, are you planning on pre-training or fine-tuning something, or playing around?
It's the let me show you. It's this is the. These two. Yeah, they're using underneath. They're using Open ACC and this package called DeVito. Yeah, if you scroll down there, you can see just the kinds of these are for simulations on ultrasound. So both ultrasound as a brain imaging technique and focused ultrasound as a kind of additional technology, especially for focal neuromodulation. But underneath, it's using this DeVito package that's Open ACC. So it's just like trying to get the GPU acceleration is super finicky. And anyway, so I've been trying out just like different GPU images, like trying to use NVIDIA's own images to, anyway. But in general, if I lose my connectivity, the jobs still run on the cloud. The problem is I still want to get some of the visualizations. So I haven't figured out how to tunnel X over the SSH on these instances. Anyway, sorry, Bradley. I was just asking about everybody's GPU. Yeah. So I've got a workstation at the lab that I use to kind of test things, and yeah. Okay.
The software that I was saying that we ended up using, so like especially for Stable Diffusion, it was, and for all the models that they have there itself, it's quite.
Okay, that's cool. Yeah. So, but these are specifically about language models.
I think there's language and image models as well.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. This work, or the work I'm doing with Neurotech at Berkeley, is like, it's just different enough that you have to do it yourself.
Oh, okay. It's like you don't have to use an existing model.
Yeah, there's no existing model. I mean, this isn't even technically deep learning.
Okay.
It's like you can use it with PyTorch. I haven't tried it. I mean, I see on their Slack, I see some people doing that, but this is kind of just like typical, like high performance computing, computational physics kind of stuff. Like it's, a lot of these are actually done just with MPI. It's just add more nodes. Slice up the problem into smaller parts and distribute it. It works really well on the kind of batch system clusters that you have in academic labs, and I just don't have anymore. I'd have no problem. Yeah. This is totally suited for the clusters I typically. I actually had a project. You can find this off my old blog, but I had a project called Star City, and it's built on this MIT project because their IT group's called Star, and it basically spins up like what looks like an academic cluster on AWS, just so I could use the same interface. Anyway, sorry, Bradley. Go back to regular scheduled programming.
Oh, it's fine. Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, so that's great. No, it's great. So let's finish up with, I think probably we'll pick a paper here.
Sometime.
I did want to talk about like this thing. This is from last week. We were talking about continual cognition or continual sampling of tasks, and it goes back to the dynamical approach. And so this is kind of a diagram that we developed for the continual AI stuff, that continual embodied AI stuff that we were working on. So there's this time scale. It's kind of like, if you think about different things that are happening at different time scales in terms of an embodied individual or an embodied system, you have a bunch of things happening, but they're happening at different time scales. So a lot of times we're interested when we do like neurosimulation, or when we talk about like different models of simulating the brain, we're thinking about neuronal activity or fast recognition of stimuli. And that happens basically at the several millisecond scale. So a lot of times for a single trial of a stimulus, we might look at an interval from 200 to 300 milliseconds, or maybe up to 500 milliseconds. And then, we report that, and it's like, well, we just assume that this just kind of continues, that you see something and you respond, and you see something and you respond, and so forth. But this sort of time scale can be expanded out in terms of the orders of magnitude. So neuronal activity and fast recognition happen within this 10 to the 0th, 10 to the second order of magnitude of milliseconds. And then if you think about this further, if you think about naturalistic scenes or doing things in the world, you have these sorts of activities that you can do. The next stop, of course, in our time scale is a short coffee break, which is maybe 15 minutes. That's 10 to the 6th milliseconds. So during a short coffee break, you might talk to people, you might have a conversation, you might think about things like, you might drink, of course, your coffee, but you might think about things, look at images, do other things. And there's this set of interactions that is not only much longer in terms of time, but then involves a number of cognitive processes in this continual engagement with the world. We have consciousness, we have attention, and all these things. And then, of course, you move from a short coffee break to something like short-term memory consolidation, where you might kind of remember things from your coffee break that you discussed and consolidate them into short-term memory. You might hear a song that you can't get out of your mind. And, there are a lot of things of memory consolidation that involve neuronal activity, populations of neurons, but then also the stimulus and dealing with that over a longer time scale. So 10 to the 8 milliseconds is about 2 hours. And so that's about the time scale of short-term memory consolidation. And then longer-term memory consolidation is like a day, so that's 10 to the 10th. You might go to sleep and then wake up the next day, and that's when a lot of longer-term memory consolidation happens, meaning that you're consolidating these memories in a longer-term storage. And then, of course, if you go to 10 to the 12th, milliseconds. Those are historical events of maybe 31 years. So, you think about historical events, living the arc of history, and being able to recall things from that arc of history. And so that's a different time scale. So this time scale is interesting because there's a lot of stuff happening. You have neuronal activity happening all along here, but you have these processes are separated out enough so that you can see that they require vastly different methods to interrogate. Vastly different types of nonlinear processes can happen. And so there are two quotes here that are of interest. The first one is from Herbert Simon, which is that everything interesting in cognition acts above the 100 millisecond level. So 100 milliseconds is probably like the, sort of the fast recognition that we think of. Maybe when we think of a visual, recognizing maybe something in a visual scene, or, we're thinking about neuronal activity, and 100 milliseconds would be more than enough to describe something like that. But everything interesting in cognition happens well above that 100 millisecond level, so that we're dealing with things like, interesting things like interactions and, longer term naturalistic behaviors, and even historical events for longer term memory consolidation and recalling those memories. So that's one quote. And then the other quote is, as you come closer to a cloud, you don't get something smooth, but irregularities at a smaller scale. And that was Ben von Mandelbrot. And Mandelbrot is interesting because he came up with the idea of fractals. And fractals are interesting here because you have a lot of self-similarity across this time scale. Like, you have neuronal activity happening at a time scale of 10 to the second, but that neuronal activity happens all along this log scale, so that for historical events, you have many, many, many instances of neuronal activity. It's all happening in the same brain, ostensibly. It's just happening, you may have memories encoded, you have behaviors that you're engaging in, you have neural processes, sometimes they adapt to the conditions that you're living in. And so all those things are self-similar. If you break this time scale down into all the instances of neuronal activity across this entire time scale, you get these repeatable events, but they're not repeatable in terms of if you drill down to each event. Each event is self-similar, but it's different in the way it operates. So that's kind of I think I wanted to bring up on that. I don't know if we have any comments on that or questions.
No, as well as like, sorry, just thinking about Michael Levin, like plenty of organisms are on different time scales than us.
Yeah.
And, and how important that is to consider when, when trying to judge their cognition.
Right.
But yeah, I think I know what Simon means, but I'm not sure that's totally true.
Well, yeah, I think in his case, yeah.
But yeah. So what was that? What was that from?
Oh, this was something that was. So we had a paper on continual embodied AI where we had a version of this times
okay.
This figure,
okay.
and then I added these quotes in. So this is something that's kind of a derivative of some of the work that we've done in that. But yeah, I mean, adding the embodied aspect to this, you have a brain but in a body, and we don't talk about that a lot in like conventional AI or machine learning, but that's something that's very important, of course, for cognition, or if you want to sort of simulate the brain, you pretty much have to have this embodied aspect. And this, of course, a lot of these naturalistic behaviors are embodied. I mean, you're doing things in the world, but you're doing them in a sort of a context or sometimes in a body, and you can't really represent them accurately unless you have that body to work with. So that was why that time scale is important. Also because you're doing this continual process of cognition where, you know, you're doing these naturalistic things and you have these different sets of neuronal events. And, you know, it's hard to really kind of separate them out. Because if you're doing a behavior over 3 or 4 minutes, you know, even if you're doing a repetitive event, you know, you're doing things like massed practice, you're doing things like, you know, adaptation. And so those kind of responses are going to change over time. And so you have a lot of interesting dynamics there.
Yeah. Yeah, basically I was saying it's like there's like various types of things I can submit under. So there's like a lightning talk or a session presentation. Like a lightning talk would be 5 to 10 minutes and a session presentation would be 30 to 40 minutes. So is there any like, how do I decide which one I should go for, or do I try applying to both and seeing?
Well, you have 30 or 40 minutes of content to deliver. I mean, it's a lot of stuff I would probably go for the shorter one, but
yeah.
Yeah,
even I was like inclined towards that itself because like I've already done like kind of a lightning talk in the GSOC lightning talks as well on the same topic. So that would be good. Okay, and like another thing that I wanted to ask was like basically they have just a second, let me pull it up. There are like 3 kind of things that you answer to like submit like 3 kind of questions. And it's like what kind of like basically my thing was do I focus on like what I did last year in the project, or do I focus on like how orthogonal lab has been like kind of doing the project over the years in general?
probably, you know, you could focus on your own work, but you could motivate it with what the lab has been doing. I mean, you know, that's usually the way people do it. They do like an overview and then drill down into that work. I think that would be good.
Okay. Yeah, and there's basically like 3 questions, which is like, what are you hoping to get from your presentation? What do you expect the audience to gain from your presentation? And how will it help better the ecosystem? So like, because I was just wondering, like the track is focusing on like the actual sustainability aspect. So like how technical do I focus on like the sustainability as well, or do I go into like the technical of how I made the project that will, you know, better working in sustainability? Any tips or anything?
You know, again, you could do some. I mean, you probably should give us some background on the sustainability part. But I think like working on the technical, it sounds like it's a technical conference. So they're probably
the rest of the tracks sound fairly technical. Yeah,
they're probably interested in the technical advances, at least, you know. But you could also mention the broader idea and the scope of it, because that is, I guess it's Linux, right? So they're interested in this topic. It's just that they're also interested in how the technical aspects too. So.
Right. So like a 50-50 balance of kind of both, I guess.
Yeah.
So like even in the how it would help the community would also be like, you know, so how sustainability would help in general, and also how like the simulation that we did would help, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'll make like a draft and I'll also send that as well if anybody has time. Just look over. But yeah, thanks a lot.
Okay, no problem.
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about this paper. This is Vidhi put this in the Slack, and I don't remember what channel it was. But this is from Current Opinions of Behavioral Sciences, Reinforcement Learning, Bringing Together Computation and Cognition. So this is kind of a review of reinforcement learning as like this cognitive aspect and then this computational aspect. So the abstract, a key aspect of human intelligence is our ability to learn very quickly. This ability is still lacking in artificial intelligence. We've talked about like zero shot and single shot learning, but these are things that are not particularly deep. So in other words, you could learn a single shot or a zero shot sort of thing, but it isn't really learning, anything very complicated. So this is something that we really are kind of aiming towards, but we haven't really achieved. This article will highlight recent research showing how bringing together the fields of artificial intelligence and cognitive science might benefit both. Ideas from artificial intelligence have provided helpful formal theories to account for aspects of human learning. In return, ideas from cognitive science and neuroscience can also inform artificial intelligence research with directions to make algorithms more human-like. For example, recent work shows that human learning can only be understood in the context of multiple separate interacting memory systems, and rather than as a single complex learner. This insight is starting to show promise in improving artificial agents' learning efficiency. So this is a nice way to kind of bring together the two fields and how, it sounds like a nice review of this and kind of thinking about how we can bring together the study of machine and human intelligence. And so they start with how AI supports cognitive research and talking about the field of reinforcement learning in particular. And the field of reinforcement learning is often highlighted as an archetype of the success of theoretical approaches to cognitive science. Computational processes that are designed by mathematicians to have theoretical guarantees are imported to model how animals modify their behavior when experiencing rewarding or aversive outcomes. And so reinforcement learning algorithms have a narrow definition. Namely, they attempt to maximize a specific cost function, the discounted sum of future expected reward. So they use this kind of optimization technique and thinking about time. So, the agent has to think about some future reward and what's expected, and then they observe rewards in the real world and they kind of align those two. So definitely thinking in terms of that timeline and how we can link neural activity with behavior and behavioral outcomes. So such a function would clearly be important for animal survival, and as such, researchers hypothesize that such RL algorithms might be implemented in the brain. So indeed, some simple RL was found to be related to learning behaviors characterized as the law of effect and summarized mathematically into a delta rule in early cognitive models of Pavlovian conditioning, which is reference 2, where better than expected outcomes lead animals, including humans, to increase the strength of an association between a predictor and an outcome. A family of simple reinforcement learning algorithms called model-free RL, such as Q-learning, that's reference 3, had been very successful at explaining learning in simpler stimulus action learning in humans and animals, and that's reference 4. So there are a number of foundational references there. Reinforcement learning algorithms have been so successful in cognitive neuroscience because they not only capture behavior, but also provide a quantitative theory for the underlying neural processes. Indeed, information carried by the neuromodulator dopamine can be modeled as a reward prediction error signal consistent with the RL framework of temporal difference learning. Those are references 1 and 5. The striatum, where dopamine modulates plasticity, encodes the choice value or policy, and it has even been suggested that distinct parts of the striatum may have distinct roles, as proposed by an RL actor-critic model. In short, there is broad agreement that a striatal dopaminergic system implements a form of model-free reinforcement learning in the brain. So this is an interesting kind of section here talking about how we have these models of reinforcement learning, and a lot of reinforcement learning is sort of, it's based on sort of what's going on with dopaminergic signaling in the striatum and in the cortex. And so especially the striatum, which, has, like, we know kind of what it does in terms of motivations, in terms of behavior, and we have this link between neurochemicals, brain anatomy, and then behavior. So we can actually make that explicit link using this theoretical model. And then, of course, because it's reinforcement learning, we can cast it into a computational framework, and we can model it in a computer, and that gives us that avenue between sort of a computational model and what's going on in the brain. So this is something that there's a lot of kind of theory in cognitive science about dopaminergic signaling and what that does. Some of it is, I think, a little bit too ambitious and gets out ahead of what dopamine actually does, and some of the dopaminergic dynamics. I mean, people will claim that dopamine is this, it's basically responsible for all addiction or all motivation, and people throw the term around a lot without thinking about the actual dynamics. But in any case, this serves as a nice model, or at least getting your arms around what's going on in decision making or in some forms of higher level cognition. So now we get to this meat of this, which is how cognitive science can support AI research. And so it really focuses on reinforcement learning. And so it just kind of gives this sort of, again, like the article we talked about earlier, and maybe unlike that article, it really gets into the details of how neuro research or cognitive research can support a specific type of artificial intelligence, and then vice versa. So you have different tools. We have these benchmarks that we want. We have different types of analysis of patterns of behavior rather than using aggregate measures. We also need to be able to dissect the behavior of simulated agents, and all of those things kind of rely on this interaction between cognitive science and reinforcement learning. And then, of course, I talk about cognitively inspired algorithms, using those in AI. And of course, we can learn both about cognition, or at least frame our questions about cognition better, and then also have this AI aspect to it, where we can build biologically inspired or cognitively inspired algorithms. And then we can also look at multiple learning systems in parallel. So again, we talked about that in the first article, the Bitter Lesson article, about how the brain is inherently about multiple learning systems or multiple sensory systems. So it's inherently multimodal, inherently multi-stream, and so that's something that we can also bring reinforcement learning to bear on. So we have these deep reinforcement learning networks such as DQN, which can be successful at sort of these approximations of state spaces, and giving us this larger space for representing these multiple learning systems. So when I say multiple learning systems, I mean that when we behave, we do all sorts of things, and we use, say, multiple memory systems more or less simultaneously to encode information. So we're always doing things like we're doing sort of episodic memory encoding, which means that we're always exploring our environment. We're looking around, we're finding scenes, and we're encoding those scenes, and then encoding them into memory, and then retrieving those memories. We also do procedural memory, or procedural learning, where we learn maybe how to walk through a maze, or we learn some other procedure, and then that gets encoded as well. We can do both episodic and procedural memory at the same time, as well as something like working memory, where you hold things in a working memory buffer for short-term recall. So, if you're trying to remember a set of words, or you're trying to keep your train of thought, or you're trying to remember a set of numbers, you keep that in working memory, and that's indeed a separate anatomical location and process from both procedural memory and episodic memory. So understanding all of these different types of memory, and then understanding their neural basis, are all kind of important to put together. And then you can also bring that together with reinforcement learning. And so this is, understanding how these work can give us a better handle on how to model this in AI agents. So that's the point here. You can also model things like executive functions, which is something that we often refer to in cognitive science as happening in the prefrontal cortex, and is the sort of learning to learn aspect of cognition. So, executive functions are sort of guiding all of this, coordinating different learning systems, and it's all kind of centered on an anatomical region. And, it's something that we haven't really been able to simulate in AI too well. We do a lot of sort of general cognitive functions in AI, but we don't model AI in a way similar to how we know cognition is organized in the brain. So, there are a lot of things to learn about that and to build models of as well. And then, of course, neuroscience can inform AI research in a number of ways, and has done so in the past. And then, of course, there's this hardware aspect where, you can make parallels between the hardware of the brain and the hardware of an artificial system. So yeah, this is a nice review. It kind of goes over some of the points quite differently than the Bitter Lesson article, I would say, and certainly is a lot more grounded in what AI can provide to cognitive science and neuroscience. And if you're interested in the references, we have a lot of good references in this paper. References on, theory and the development of Pavlovian conditioning and reinforcement learning, and cue learning, and other types of things. This is an article, The Framework for Mesencephalic Dopamine Systems Based on Predictive Heavy Learning. That's a classic paper. So there are a lot of good references in this paper. Okay.
Yeah, that in particular is a classic.
Yeah.
Yeah. Who shared this? Because this is an old paper. It's cool.
Yeah, Vidhi put it in the Slack, and the author. I'm sorry. Yeah, I don't know where they got it. Yeah.
I'm just realizing that that's not two authors, that's just one author.
Yeah, it's one author. It's one author.
So that is better known as Ann Collins.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Computational Cognitive Neuroscience Lab. So just, it's a cool, it's a good group.
Yeah.
And,
all right. Well, I think that's it for this week. We keep in mind that Google Summer Code project proposals are due soon.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to ask whether you guys have seen my proposal and what your thoughts are, and if I can make any changes or anything that you all would like me to do additionally.
Okay. Well, I looked at it. I think it looks pretty good, so that's good. I don't really have any changes. I mean, I think you get off everything.
Okay, because actually I was like, even on the GitHub that I saw, like this is not the first time an RL model is coming up, right? Like last year we had the Llamas model, but we keep having different RL models, right? So I just wanted to like ask whether it's completely fine if I again have an RL model, like that won't hinder my acceptance rate or anything, right?
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, keep in mind that those are due soon. So it's if you're still working on it, yeah. I think the deadline is like the 7th of April, so it's next week, I think.
Yeah.
All right, thanks. See you next week.
Well, thanks a lot. Bye. See you next week.
Okay.
Take care.
Take care. Bye.